Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. My name is Carey Nieuwhof. It's so good to be with you again, leaders. And today from Barna, I am joined by Brooke Hempell. Brooke, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Carey.
So we are toward the tail end of Black History Month, and so excited to have Bryan Loritts on with us in just a few moments. But obviously, this is a cause, racial justice, equality, very close to Barna's heart for years and years and years. And fortunately for the church and for every leader, a lot of data, some of which goes back decades, some of which much more recent. So I would love for you to take us through a couple of key findings, and then we'll get Bryan's take on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Barna has been tracking a lot of these trends about people's faith engagement and, how they engage with the Bible and their beliefs around faith. And those have been decades that we've been watching that. One of the things that we have noticed for years is that specifically in the US, amongst African Americans, the importance of their faith and the role of their faith in everyday life is really, really essential. We've known for years that their engagement with Scripture is, probably the highest in our nation amongst different ethnic groups. And that's a really remarkable trend that's just, I think, led to the church being very healthy. So we had some releases of data in honor of Black History Month, where we were looking at specific questions around what is there for the importance of their religious faith to Black Americans. And we asked, for example, would you say to your average American, to your average African American, would you say that it's important or necessary to understand the role of religious faith in the lives of Black people in order to understand the African American experience? And that number is even up this year. So we asked that question 25 years ago, and it was 71% of all Black adults said yes. And it's 79% in 2020.
Wow.
Which is remarkable because, on the whole, we've seen church engagement decline, but that root of faith is still there and still really, really strong in the African American experience.
Yeah, that is something I remember. David and I were talking last year on an episode, and I think like you hinted, everything from scripture reading to prayer to personal devotion, we tend to see trends in the white church or non-Black church. It's dissipating, but it's very, very strong in the African American church, which is super encouraging to see. Anything else you want to share with us while we got you, Brooke?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be releasing in a few weeks a study called Beyond Diversity. And we've shared a few stats from this research. It's a kind of another 20-year update following Michael Emerson's great book, Divided by Faith, where we first explore the fact that, oh, wow, on Sunday mornings, we're quite divided by our ethnic backgrounds and what's behind that. And so we are exploring that again with Michael Emerson and a larger crew. And that research will be coming out in a couple of weeks. And we have really explored a lot of different angles on perceptions of race in the US and on the way that that's a part of people's church experience for those who are churchgoers, and then how churches ought to deal with that. So one of the things that we have really noticed, for example, is that their perceptions of the importance of race or the degree to which that's an issue that we should be concerned about is very different by ethnic group. So if we look at white adults in the US, and this is not necessarily in the church, but just white adults, we would see in 2020 that 37% say that we have a race problem in this country. And if we look at Black American adults in the US this year, it's 76%. To some degree, it's like, well, of course
the
we
opposite.
Do. Yeah.
You're saying only 37% of white adults say that there's a race problem in the US?
Right. Wow. And that's in 2020, right? That was taken, during the middle of probably one of the most active years in a long time, in decades, in terms of raising the issues of racial justice. So that's pretty amazing. But then we look at, well, okay, if you do think there are issues that we need to address, where should we look for that? And many white practicing Christians, as well as African American and Latino and Asian, would say that there's a role for the church in that, which is really interesting. Interestingly, white practicing Christians are more likely to say that they see a role for church. 65% say that. whereas only 48% say there's a role for government. But
Hmm.
if you look at Black practicing Christians, they say almost the same. 69% say there's a role for churches, but 81% say there's a role for government in addressing some of these issues. So it's an interesting dynamic of this is not just a faith question. It's not just something that can be resolved, just by digging into our scripture. This is a much broader issue that people really want to be able to address from different aspects of life.
Well, that's super helpful. So give us a little more of a sneak peek into Beyond Diversity. And if leaders want to access that, you can go to barna.com/Beyond Diversity. You can pre-order it so you don't have to wait. And it comes out in April. And if you use a promo code ChurchPulse15, you'll get a discount. Anything else you want to say on that before we invite Bryan into the conversation?
Yeah, without just giving you the specific stats, I'll kind of lay out something that I know Bryan can speak really well to, which is a lot of the study looked at the role of multi-ethnic churches and how to do that in a way that's healthy. And one of the things that we studied was how are each of these different ethnic groups doing in a multi-ethnic setting. And we did see that if you were non-white in a multi-ethnic church setting, you were more likely to report experiencing racial discrimination or just not feeling like you belonged, or not finding your place. And so that's something that, I know that's a layup that Bryan can really speak to. How do leaders do this well? How do we create healthy environments where people can really grow in their faith and also be experiencing flourishing in all of their lives?
Well, I think it's time to go there. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode, Brooke. Really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And let's invite Bryan Loritts into the conversation. He is the teaching pastor at the Summit Church in North Carolina, a pastor, author, speaker, president, and founder of the Kainos movement. And Bryan, it's so good to have you. Welcome.
Carey, this is a bucket list item for me. So great being with you, bro.
Hey, it's awesome. I'd love to get your reaction to some of the data that you've heard. Just pick something, anything, any thoughts? I know it surprised me in the data. Wow.
Well, I would say, as far as the high percentage of African Americans who, their Christianity is something they engage in on a day-to-day basis and intertwine that in their daily lives, that kind of affirms what I've always felt. So that bit of data was not surprising, but it did kind of make me ask why. And my suspicion, Carey, would be, prosperity is a terrible teacher. And when you are in a situation where historically you've been behind the proverbial 8 ball, and there's kind of been this struggle motif in oppression, Christianity doesn't just become something nice for you, it becomes something necessary. And so the Black church was birthed within the context of slavery. The Black church kind of came of age in the middle of Jim Crow. It's always kind of been this place where we could find hope and get what we need to kind of make it throughout the week until we came back on that Sunday. So it affirms what I saw in my grandparents. It affirms what I see in my parents and what has been handed down to me. So that bit was very affirming.
Yeah, I think the part that really struck me was the 37% of white Americans who think we have a race problem in the United States, which means the majority do not. That really, really, really shocked me and kind of goes, I was going to ask you about this at the end, but it kind of brought up the question, like, I think we see that tension in the church too. There was some data that David brought to a previous episode of Church Pulse Weekly, where the number of Caucasian pastors who were willing to talk about racial reconciliation actually dropped in 2020, which is, I'd just love for you to speak to that for a moment, because my fear is that there's a lot of leaders listening, maybe leaders who look like me, who would be like, I've already heard enough about this. I got other stuff to do, or I don't know what to do. What would you say to those leaders and to the great indifference that still seems to be lodged in the minds of some leaders when it comes to racial justice?
Oh, well, several things. One, I have a friend of mine who says, something only becomes a problem when it becomes a problem for you. And oftentimes, I think that statistic of 37% of our white evangelical friends only acknowledging that there's a race problem. I think that's a commentary, most likely, on the state of their relationships. I just don't know how you can have deep, meaningful relationships across the ethnic divide and that not build your empathy muscles, that not build a sense of awareness for what's around you. And so I look at the division that's here, and I look at stats like that, and I say at the end of the day, Carey, we really don't know each other, right? And I think when I'm walking in relationship with people, I used to think, I hate to admit this, I used to think to be wealthy meant to be heartless. Wow. Until I got some wealthy friends. And I'm not saying that there's not some heartless, wealthy people. Of course there is. But when I actually started to do life with some of them, those stereotypes got kicked to the curb. Or when my 19-year-old son is watching the George Floyd thing happen, and with tears in his eyes, he's wondering, where is God? And there's a sense of unrighteous anger that I sensed in him towards white people. I literally had to say, you can't say that about all white people. What about Uncle Adam and Aunt Nikki, this Swedish couple that we do vacation with? Or what about Bobby and Heather Conway? And I just start naming the names. It's hard to be racially indifferent with people who are constantly at your dinner table.
I think one of the things that I've probably learned the most over the last year is from my African-American friends, some of whom have been on this podcast, others it's just text conversations. But I think my eyes got opened to the level of injustice, discrimination, dismissal that they still experience. I think I was kind of blind to it. Like even a year ago, I just didn't see it. And these friendships, some of them go back a decade or longer, but I didn't realize how much systemic bias there is, or daily bias. However, I don't want to get political about it, but you know what I mean? There is something baked in that I don't face as a white male. And I think that has been one of my biggest learnings over the last year. It's like, oh, this is even more real and more current than I thought. What kinds of, and that's come through, podcast interviews, private conversations. I unfortunately in the last year haven't had the luxury of jumping on an airplane and having dinner with some of those friends because of COVID. But what are some ways to sort of go beneath the surface? Because there's probably some leaders listening who would say, well, I have diverse relationships, but we just never seem to go there. Like we get along great. We just hang out, we do vacations together. We go fishing together. But that stuff never comes up. They seem to be doing fine. Is there a way to go? Are there questions that are helpful in probing the relationship?
Yeah. So I think, Jamar Tisby makes a lot of this acronym ARC, A-R-C, that is incredibly helpful in fostering intentionality. It's awareness, relationships, and commitment. And I think the first thing is just flipping on a switch and looking at some of these tragic incidents and saying, how can I learn from this? Entering into intentional conversations with people. I just sat last night at one of our campuses. The elders got together and they discussed a film. American Skin is the name of the film that deals with this issue of race in a very beautiful, refreshing way that incites conversation. And we sat in a circle together. There's probably 12 to 15 of us just dialoguing. Did we solve the world's problems? No, but did we hear each other's perspective? Yeah. And the rallying point was a simple thing as let's watch a film together, intentionally reading a book together that dives into some of these things is huge. Going out to coffee. One of my closest white friends said he prayed about our friendship a year before he even knew I existed. He just felt like I just need to enter into friendship with someone who is African American, and he made this a matter of prayer. And I was in answer to his prayers. But it's being intentional. It's owning what you don't know, and it's entering into experiences and relationships with people who are different.
Well, pulling the camera back a little more, when you think about the last 12 months, which we're all still reeling from and in the middle of, what has surprised you the most personally?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think the key word here is surprise, right? As horrific as the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were, I wouldn't necessarily put that in the category of surprising, which is unfortunate for me to say. I would say the storming of the Capitol on January 6th was incredibly surprising to me. Never would I have thought that I would see something like that in my life. And I'm not getting partisan here at all. And, I'm not going to guess who incited what, but to see that happen, and to not only see it happen, but to see, Jesus saves banners next to Confederate flags inside the Capitol was disheartening. Now, to put this kind of, to encapsulate it in a race category, the thing that me and my African-American colleagues and friends pause and say is there's just no way, if that was an all Black crowd or a mostly Black crowd, we would have even gotten up the steps to get into the Capitol. So even then, it kind of drifts back into that racial narrative and just go, they were afforded an opportunity that if you knew in advance, a group of African Americans were coming pretty ticked off to have a protest in our nation's capital, they would have, put out fences, had all kinds of armed guards. We wouldn't have even had that opportunity. But instead, you see it the other way. In fact, one of these individuals with the Vikings horns, he gets thrown in jail and goes on a hunger strike because they don't have organic food. His lawyer petitions the judge, and he ends up getting organic food. And I'm just going, in what world would that happen to an African-American person? So surprising and disheartening all at once, Carey.
What, and you may have already answered this, what discouraged you the most?
I would say within the Christian community, our reactions, our polarized reactions among some of these incidents. With the George Floyd thing, I was wonderfully surprised at the amount of white empathy and support that I and the African American community received from that. On the other hand, you look at a lot of these incidents, and then you read the comments on people's social media posts.
Comments, yes.
And you just go, not that I'm agreeing or disagreeing with what an individual says, but the polarized reactions paints a scenario that we just don't know each other. We really don't know each other. And that's where I'm just going, that's why I'm a big believer in the multi-ethnic church, because, you put people in a similar space. You get them in settings where they're sharing their experiences and their perspectives. You can't argue a person's experience. You can't argue a person's perspective. But what's disheartening is that sometimes I can hear by the way a person talks and go, you don't have a white friend, or you don't have a Black friend, because if you did, it's not that you wouldn't believe that. You would have a lot more empathy and compassion there.
Well, and that may apply to the political, overlay on everything as well. You don't have a Democratic friend, or you don't have a Republican friend, or you don't have an independent friend. I want to talk a little bit about the political wash that seems to be over, because whether it was the assault on the Capitol or whatever you want to call it, I mean, it's almost everything from masks to no mask to vaccine to no vaccine to reopening to not reopening to everything has a political taint. I was on social just before this interview, and someone was just saying, hey, look at all the COVID numbers dropping by such a, in this moment, such a level. And there was a comment from somebody I've known for years who just said, maybe that has something to do with the inauguration and the way it's being interpreted. And I'm like, really? Like everything has a wash on it these days. How are there strategies you've discovered to depoliticize the conversation?
Well, So first of all, I think what we're experiencing and what you're pointing to, Carey, is sadly we've allowed Fox News and MSNBC and CNN to disciple us more than Jesus.
Mhm.
So I think we are filtering Jesus um, through these news outlets instead of vice versa. So I think that's the first thing. I would say secondly is, we have to legitimately pause and say, can we agree that the kingdom of God is bigger than a political party?
That'd be a stretch for some people, I think.
It's unbelievable. So if we can just check that box, then we have to say, no one if Jesus can fit neatly within your political party, your Jesus isn't big enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we can say he doesn't, then we're free enough to say, when I go to the voting booth, there's probably going to be a tension in that I'm looking at a candidate going, there's things I love, there's things I don't love. And I look at this one over here, there's things I love, there's things I don't love. And you vote your conscience. And then you give other people the freedom to be able to vote their consciences as well. But it comes back to a discipleship issue. The Jesus we follow typically is smaller than Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity and Don Lemon and Rachel Maddow. And we have to acknowledge that we serve a bigger Christ. As Tony Evans says, Jesus hasn't come to ride the backs of donkeys or elephants. Jesus isn't coming back on Air Force One, right? His kingdom is not of this world. So I really just think it's that simplistic. And I also think it's political idolatry.
Yeah.
I can always point out my idols based on how disproportionate my emotional reaction is to something. Like if I have more joy over something than Jesus, or if I'm more disappointed in something than my own sin, I've probably identified my idol, right? And so we should engage in the democratic process. We should leave space for other people to have different convictions than us. And we should just leave room in a very Romans 14 kind of a way to say, okay, we see it differently. Who I vote for is not an essential matter of faith, and America is not God's country. And then we can just kind of keep it moving from there, Carey.
Yeah, and that too would be a big, line. America is not God's country, but it's interesting. We live in a world that he loves and he died for. And does God love America? Of course he loves America, but perhaps he moves in other nations and other peoples as well, is what you're saying, right?
More than perhaps. Absolutely.
I know very diplomatic,
but it's absolutely
heaven's pretty diverse from what I can tell.
Yes, absolutely. So,
but isn't it weird? I mean, you've been in leadership long enough to know that thinking about even having to couch all these words a decade ago would be bizarre.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. There has been, the cultural shift that's taken place within the last 10 to 15 years is breathtaking.
Yeah.
Pastoring now and the issues that are coming at me as a pastor now are so different, of course, than when I graduated seminary in the late 90s. Seminary was addressing questions the culture isn't even asking anymore. And it's changed a whole lot. And then within the multi-ethnic space, Carey, you figure out pretty quickly, ethnic diversity breeds all other kinds of diversity. Theological diversity. There is political diversity within that. And so how do you navigate it in such a way where you keep the main thing, and there's unity in the midst of beautiful diversity? That's the
challenge.
Get
income diversity too, right? As soon as you have a multi-ethnic, as you start to really represent your community, you get all kinds of diversity.
Absolutely.
How do you, maybe it's a better question, keep the conversation somewhat civil, respectful, and real in your church?
On political or racial matters?
Yeah, let's start there. Sure. Because it's very easy to descend into sound bites, to comments, to fighting. I I talked to a pastor a couple of weeks ago, and he was having to break up a fight that was happening on social media between volunteers in his church. He's like, I don't even have a category for this. Like, come on. And it was shortly after the Capitol riots or whatever. And so, I mean, it's just so complicated. So just for leaders who are saying, yeah, you're reading my mail, Bryan, 100%. We have all kinds of conflict in our church, and maybe we're not as diverse as yours. How have you fostered really helpful, therapeutic, kingdom type conversations with real people?
So I think a couple things. On a very surface level, we like a lot of churches, I'm guessing in 2020, we were just dealing with, we're a multi-ethnic church. There's the pressure of quarantine life and COVID. There's kind of this racial boiling pot that we're in 2020. And we've got this social media thing. We've got about 300 staff at our church, various viewpoints on things. We spent a lot of time pressing into a social media policy that says, look, your social media is not just your social media. You've got people at our church that are following you, and we just want us to steward that well. And so we gave some guidelines for our leaders that we encourage you to talk about matters of race, but the policy spells out how to do that without causing division. That's one thing. Two, I found Andy Stanley to be very, very helpful. He once said to me, and he wasn't talking about race, I think he was talking about the issue of abortion, but still, it's helping me as I think about how to process very divisive topics. He says, there's some things I'll only talk about in circles, not in rows. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. So I try not to, even though I do preach on race from time to time from the stage, I always want to do that in conjunction with, hey, this week or in the coming weeks, our small groups are going to be engaging in this very topic because we have to give people space to process these things. And so I've found that to be a helpful way to not just say it from the pulpit, but to create an intimate environment where people can roll up their sleeves and really hash it out with one another.
That's really good advice. And Andy has talked about that in terms of sexuality and so many other issues. There are things he will talk about face to face that he just finds it impossible to have a helpful conversation online about. Okay, that's good. And I'm glad you mentioned like a social media policy, because my feed is like everyone's feed. I follow a lot of church leaders. And sometimes almost daily, I sit there and I'm like, the world is watching, right? I know this is your personal account, but you understand, and not just church people, unchurched people are watching. And they're watching this stuff come out and they're like, yeah, last place I want to be is a church. So thank you for that. So It's Black History Month. What would you want non-Black people to know about the Black experience in this country or in the church?
Yeah, well, first I would encourage everybody, we set it aside as Black History Month because historically, the African-American experience was not integrated in curriculum in our schools. And so we wanted to take a specific allotted period of time to just say, hey, here's our story. There's an old African proverb, Carey, that says, until the lion tells his side of a hunt, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. In other words, as long as it's just one side telling it, it's not going to be a full story. And so, Black history, I would say, first of all, is American history. It's Canadian history. Many African Americans who were slaves, they found refuge in Canada. And so I would say, go on this journey with us. Engage it with us, whether or not you can. I'm posting every single day on my on my Instagram account, and you can do simplistic things like that. You can say, for the month of February, I'm only going to read things written by people of color, whether it's rich theological books. I mean, Tony Evans' book, Oneness Embraced, is just a wonderful book. I've written some things. There's great kind of Black fiction writers out there who've written things. But I think it's a month of intentionality, that you can go, let me intentionally engage in this. So I would say just make it a thing of awareness. Read something, watch something. I started to say go to a museum. I don't know how that's working in the midst of COVID, but just be intentional about it. Around our church, we talk about Martin Luther King holiday, that Monday that we celebrate as national holiday, as not being a day off, but a day on. And again, what the spirit behind that is being absolutely intentional and engaging these things.
My wife is reading The Warmth of Other Suns right now, which is quite a book, really. Yep. And I'm getting the book report from her almost on a daily basis. And it's eye-opening. I'm going to read that one as well when she's finished with it. But, you reminded me, what shocked me about that is how this is truly an American problem, not a North-South. I mean, I grew up across the river from Detroit in Windsor. Racism was a thing there. And the Underground Railway ran to about 15 minutes from where I'm standing, 10 minutes from where I'm standing. Wow. This little African Methodist Episcopal church, which I've actually been to, but I don't know enough about it. And so you give me reason to go figure out what happened to those freed slaves when they showed up 20 minutes from where I live. So yep. I'm gonna go research that.
No, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns is just a phenomenal book on the Great Migration. Made me think of my own grandparents who migrated up from North Carolina to New Jersey. Reads like a novel. I highly recommend. So yeah.
So your book, Insider Outsider: My Journey as a Stranger in White Evangelicalism. Tell us one or two things that would surprise non-Black leaders listening about your experience in white evangelicalism.
Wow. One of two things. Well, the argument of the book that I make, Carey, is we desperately need white evangelicals. Evangelical is a good word. It literally means good news. And it's the idea of the gospel. And I want to hold on to that. But I argue that while we need white evangelicals, we don't need white evangelicalism. And in that being kind of a system. And so one of the things I point out is, if I could talk to my 20-something-year-old self, I would say, calm down, Bryan. A lot of what you are labeling as racism or being racist is, and I use this in a non-pejorative way, is just sheer ignorance. Like the average white person, the older I get, the more I'm just convinced they don't see themselves consistently and consciously as being white, right? And so because of that, they tend to normalize their way of viewing the world and their way of doing things. So when I teach at a seminary, I teach preaching at a seminary, and the first day of class, I'll ask the students, what's Black preaching? And they'll raise their hands. And we'll have a discussion. What's Black theology? And they'll raise their hands. Then I go, well, what's white preaching? What's white theology? And they're dumbfounded, and I don't let them off the hook. I said, you've got 45 minutes to discuss it and report back. And the reason why it's a struggle, Carey, is that it is hard to explain and describe what you have normalized and mainstreamed. And so there is a specific way our white brothers and sisters have of approaching the world that when you couple that with them typically occupying seats of power and them not seeing their whiteness, and I don't use that negatively at all, that can easily drift over into oppression. That I have my way, and if you don't form or conform into my way, then there's this sense in which I otherize you. And that's what I'm trying to get to in the book by my own experience, how I experienced that in Bible college, how I've experienced that working in churches, even multi-ethnic churches. And so I think that'll be a thing that'll surprise the reader as they go along this hopeful journey.
Can you share one or two experiences that you had? Like, how did Albert Tate talked about feeling the necessity to speak in a certain way? Sam Collier said a similar thing on this podcast where it was like, well, I knew if I wanted to fit in a white world, I couldn't talk like this. I had to talk like this. And, those have really stuck with me. Those are two of the leaders who've really helped me see things in a fresh way over the last year. So what would be some similar experiences for you where you're like, okay, those of you in the dominant culture, here's what you need to understand.
Yeah, I think, I think to add to this, so I've done Bible college, and I've done seminary, um, and a doctorate degree, but the doctorate is separate. So I just put Bible college and seminary. I never, in about 6.5, 7 years of Bible college and seminary, I never was asked to read a person of color. So in all the syllabi, when I looked at my required reading, not one single author of color was required of me to read.
Wow.
Sitting in my preaching classes, all the examples of great preachers were white men. Charles Stanley, D. Martin Lloyd Jones, John Piper, so on and so forth. And don't get me wrong, these are great preachers. But here's what I'm saying though, Carey, and it goes back to my previous point. At that moment where, do I believe my white professors said, I'm typing out this syllabus, I want them only reading white people? I don't believe that. Or if they're giving me great examples of great preachers, are they consciously thinking, let me leave out Black preachers? I don't believe that for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But because you don't see the world intentionally through a multi-ethnic lens, and you kind of see it through your normal viewpoint, and you ignore the fact that you've been created by God to be white, that allows you kind of to ignore me. Yeah. And so I would say that's the thing, is I've been pretty much ignored. And then over time, what happens to you is, as you navigate these spaces, they say, well, do you know another person like you? And what they mean by that is an individual who can assimilate into our way and come across as if they're safe. That's been hard. That's been hard.
You mentioned that you don't always address race or justice from the pulpit, but when you do, how do you approach it in a way that's really helpful in a multi-ethnic setting?
Yeah, so I don't, let me just preface this by saying, I don't agree with everything Robin DiAngelo says, but in her book, White Fragility, she makes a point that in my experience, I have seen to be true. And she talks about this whole thing of stamina. And that when it comes to conversations on race, our white brothers and sisters don't have quite the stamina to endure these conversations as people of color do. I think that's a fact. So every time I've ever preached on race, I can count on people walking out, and 99 out of 100 of them will be white. All right. What I've learned over the years to do is I try to always preach in general from an expository posture. In other words, I want to show you that this is in the text. And if you have a problem with it, your problem isn't with me. You should probably take it up with God. So that's number one. When I talk about race, especially, and Albert does this really well, I try to interject a lot of humor.
Right.
Right. You take a serious topic and you want to use humor well to put people at ease. And then I'll say some really truthful things, like, I had a staff guy say to me a couple of years ago, Bryan, if you could live at any time in world history, when would it be? I said, as a Black man, now. Like 1753 wasn't good for me. 1853 wasn't good. 1953. So I want them to understand that I'm not here wielding the Bible as an Uzi to get back at them. That I'm not, you're my brother in Christ, you're my sister in Christ. One of the prayers I often pray, Carey, before I preach is, Lord, help me to just live out the great commandment in the preaching moment, that people, when they hear me preach, would go, he loves God and he loves me.
Wow.
And that's especially true when you talk about race, right? You are my brother and sister in Christ. And yeah, there's times in which we've got to have family talk. And, Paul talks about rebuking, but I think you can still do that in a way that is honoring to their humanity, that isn't trying to come across like you have an axe to grind. and that's really important. This is the last thing I'll say, Carey, is I'm a pastor, not a prophet. And those are two different things. Prophets punch you in the mouth. They're just concerned with thus saith the Lord. Pastors, we're shepherds. We're with sheep, and sheep don't often get it. And A. Lewis Patterson, the great African-American pastor from Houston who went home to be with the Lord a few years ago, he says there's three qualifications for pastors: patience with people, patience with people, patience with people. And at no point do you need more patience than when it comes to trying to disciple people in this area of ethnic unity.
Wow. What do you do, or do you do anything with the brothers and sisters who walk out the door when you open your mouth on the subject, or do you just kind of let them go?
Well, you know, of course, every time I preach on this, I can expect, you know, email, pushback, things of that nature. And I think, Carey, you know, I always respond, you know, as leaders, you get this too, Carey. You know, people email you very strong. And then what happens is when you go, hey, would love to, here's my phone number. Can we talk about this? Or, hey, can we get a cup of coffee or whatever? They'll typically back up a little bit. It's that whole idea of being bold in their letters, right? But that's the work of being a pastor. Yeah. So I always want to take the opportunity to bring them close and to walk with them. And when a person has a hard time, they send me a very hard email, I always take that as an opportunity to make room in my schedule to sit down face to face, if possible. And if not, then at least voice to voice, so they can hear my heart, I can hear theirs, and we can walk with one another in this. See, Leadership 101 says, I can't take people to a place I'm not venturing towards myself. I can't truly preach reconciliation and be bitter towards white people at the same time. And that's how Jonah ends. That's how Jonah, I mean, Jonah, I don't think it gets enough credit. It's got a huge racial narrative. Here you have this minority Jew who's being called of God to take the gospel to Gentile oppressors. And he gets ticked off that God shows kindness to the ones who've been mean to them. And Jonah is racially incensed. And Carey, I see that a lot among people of color towards our white brothers and sisters. Is that a two-way street? Absolutely. What I'm saying is, if you're going to engage in this work, you're going to take a lot of hits, and you got to steward your emotional well-being. You have to guard your heart well, and you're going to have to learn and lean into the Spirit of God to keep bitterness out of your heart and to love people well. And you know who does this the best?
Who?
John Perkins. I don't know if you've interviewed John Perkins. He's 90 years old, but you talk about a man who he was beaten and left for dead in a Mississippi jail during the Civil Rights Movement. But there's no bitterness in him. There's nothing but profound love. I say, I want to be like that.
I've always wondered how that happens. I really do. No, that's a good thing. Maybe I'll do that. You know, I've got a list of people I want to interview this year who are still alive. And we're very fortunate to have gifts like that still with us. Bryan, anything else you want to share? This has been so helpful.
Yeah, you know, the last thing I'll say, Carey, is someone was saying to me, they were commenting on President Trump and just feeling like he's caused a lot of division. And I pushed back on that. I said, you know what? I don't necessarily want to be quick to say he's caused a lot of division. I think what he's done is he's exposed a lot of division. I think he's given people permission to express how they really feel about things. And in that sense, it's a gift. And what I want to see the church do is move from playing defense to playing offense. So instead of waiting to react, something happens, let's put out a statement, let's have a lament service. We need to play offense. And what I mean by playing offense is, I think the American church has only viewed discipleship from its individualized Western perspective, whereby we view discipleship as just you and Jesus. Let me teach you how to have a quiet time. Let me teach you how to share your faith. Let me teach you, how to pray. And all these things are core curriculum. But discipleship biblically in an Eastern environment is much more communal. So you have Jesus picking 12 individuals. Among them are Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the zealot, two polar opposites. And he says, I want y'all close together. I want you walking together. And we have not been discipled communally. And I think to play offense means we've got to bring people of different political persuasions, different racial backgrounds, different ideologies, and say, we love Jesus. Now we've got to learn to walk together and be discipled into his image together.
That is a beautiful and wonderful place to close. Bryan, thank you so much for being with us today on Church Pulse Weekly. It's been a gift, and really grateful for your leadership and all that you're bringing to your church and to the church. So Bryan's written a number of books. Make sure you pick up Insider, Outsider, and go to barna.com/Beyond Diversity. Use the code Church Pulse Weekly to pre-order the report that comes out in April. Bryan, thanks for being such a gift to us today. For those of you who are joining us on a regular basis, we'll be back soon with a fresh episode. We have John Mark Comer, Dave Adamson, and others coming up. And if you're brand new to this conversation, make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. And we do this every single week. So thanks so much for being with us today.